There has never been a better time in the history of mankind to be completely, cripplingly, devastatingly alone. And yet, here you are, thinking about giving up on the good times. This is the opening monologue from Actual Sunlight. Released in 2013, players assume the role of Evan Winter, a man in his 30s living with depression. He finds his day-to-day life to be a struggle. The player attempts to navigate Evan's life, although this quickly becomes pushing him through the motions. Wake up, get dressed, go to work, go home. Repeat endlessly, with only minimal variation between the days with which to separate them. The player is occasionally given the illusion of choice, but the game doesn't pretend that they're anything but. For instance, midway through the game, Evan has a choice between wasting his money on a video game that he doesn't want, or not buying anything and leaving the store. If you attempt the latter, Evan will quote Fight Club to you and tell you there's no choice but buying it. He's here for that game and there is no way out of it. No matter how many times you actively exit the store, the game will not progress until you concede to it. The choice isn't even binary. The gameplay exists for no other purpose than to further the narrative. Due to this, Actual Sunlight lives or dies depending wholly on your engagement with the story and characters. Most of your playtime will be spent reading Evan's inner monologue, usually presented as text on a black screen. This might initially seem awkward and unengaging, but these sequences firmly hold the game together. Most of the writing is genuinely impactful, touching on eating disorders, the nature of addiction, and romantic relationships formed purely out of desperation. They are deeply personal subjects, but their exploration is not uncommon in art. In fact, the current zeitgeist is gripped in any number of works that clumsily misrepresent mental illness. Actual Sunlight stands out from the crowd due to how unromantic it is. Evan's posturings on his personal life and the world around him don't feel fictional. They feel like they've been suffered through by a real person, and that's because they have. The protagonist is a minimally changed self-insert of the developer Will O'Neill. He's very open about the game's autobiographical nature and appears not to have sugarcoated his life at all. Obviously, there are degrees of separation, but some of Evan's memories are retold with such sincerity and distinctiveness that it seems likely Mr. O'Neill is relaying one of his own experiences. Taking this into account, if the best parts of the game are text, why bother making a game at all? The story could make the transition from game to novel while keeping the events and tone intact. If anything, a novel would probably increase the story's reach and would avoid some holes in presentation. The sprites of named characters look decent for the most part, but background characters are woefully out of place. Many have outlandish anime hairstyles with half a dozen blue-haired NPCs walking the streets in medieval dresses. This green-haired homeless man appears to be wearing a magician's cloak. Without spoiling it, there's a serious moment towards the end that I feel is undermined by the use of fighting game sprites. These are, of course, minor elements, and would not have been an issue had the game been a novel instead. However, I feel as though this would have betrayed Will's vision. The story of a video game should be communicated, or at least enhanced, by interactivity, the same way that a film's story should be communicated through moving images, and a novel's through the written word. Games should be free to use cutscenes, but by creating a narrative-focused game, we are forced to assume that the story gains something from being interactive, that it would be in some way diminished were it to be told in a different medium. What Remains of Edith Finch could probably have made a decent novel, and This War of Mine could have been a politically charged indie film. But if they were, I doubt academia, or many other people for that matter, would have noticed them. It's in how these ideas are expressed to an active participant that they come alive. You're not reading a girl wander through her childhood home, you're exploring it yourself. You're not watching someone stab another person in order to feed their children, you're the one driving in the knife. There's a very real sense of empathy and drama to these stories that they would lose if the narrative did not require input. With this in mind, let's go back to that department store. You can buy a game that's reviewed well, that you aren't overly interested in, or just leave. It might not seem like that vital of a decision to be making, but if you're using video games as a form of escape, going without one could be a daunting concept. If you're particularly desperate for escape and nervous about trying other forms of entertainment, this may quickly become a routine. It's the antithesis of what Telltale and many others aimed for. Your choices in actual sunlight often don't matter, and this is told to you immediately after making one. As the player, you're helpless to stop the decision, but you are still responsible for it anyway. You have the same feeling when making these choices that Evan does. Reading or watching Evan make this choice by himself wouldn't communicate it very effectively. It could be argued that not giving the player a choice is equally as toothless, but I'm not so sure. The browser game, Spent, sees players in the role of a parent living in poverty. Players have a set amount of money, and each day provides some sort of dilemma that requires either spending money or doing something uncomfortable. The point of the game was to increase empathy among players for those living in poverty or the homeless. However, the game had the opposite effect. Many players did better with the choices than they thought they would, and left with the impression that they could easily survive poverty. By giving players the ability to say no to buying the game, to ask the girl out at work, to go to the gym, to make Evan behave in ways he normally wouldn't, would undercut the game's meaning. Players might come to the conclusion that depression isn't so tough if improving Evan's life was as easy as clicking a button. Most of his problems have been unraveling for years at this point, and Evan feels so behind that he doubts he'll ever be able to catch up. To have a sudden rise from the ashes, or even a hidden choice meter that measures your depression levels, would have been inappropriate. The last thing I'd ever want to see from a project like this is a walkthrough on how to beat depression. If you are interested in playing the game for yourself, I'd recommend doing so before watching the rest of this video, as it will contain minor plot spoilers from here on out. It's worth mentioning that the conclusions I'm about to come to do not apply to Will. Evan Winter is a fictional character within his own right, and I will be treating him as such. Evan is exceedingly bitter about the people around him. In his world, no one gains success through hard work or skill. He silently accuses his boss, family members, and co-workers of foul play to explain their success, possibly in order to excuse his lack of it. It's difficult to determine how much of this is true and how much is just Evan's perception of things. Next to nothing positive happens throughout the game. Evan has an incredibly low opinion of almost everyone he meets, portraying them in his mind as either beaten down by life or unrealistically incompetent. The worst recipient of this is the character of Russell, who eventually becomes the new boss. In a happenstance meeting, he openly gloats about being corrupt, articulating very clearly that he doesn't care about his customers or employees, before declaring that the entire company is useless in less than a minute. He then starts psychoanalyzing Evan, correctly guessing his opinions on the company and how disenfranchised he feels about his own life. As his final insult, he adds that Evan's crush, Tori, is leaving the company due to how much he creeped her out. Evan leaves, flustered, while Russell yells about his hot girlfriend and going to the gym. This is so unbelievably cartoonish that I don't think we have much choice but to accept it as Evan's fantasy. Russell being corrupt is fine. Russell bragging about ripping the company off to an employee whilst in the building is pushing it, but acceptable. Russell being Flash Thompson and quoting every stereotype of a crooked businessman is a bridge too far. Even if we suspend our disbelief, Russell's arguments don't make any sense. Nobody who brags about being the boss of a company would then say in the same breath that the company is worthless. Furthermore, a man who doesn't care about his company, position, or employees would not bother to explain all of this to an employee that he doesn't like. I have a suspicion that the crude presentation is intentional. A man who imagines that all success comes only through corruption would of course extend that belief to his boss, especially if that boss happens to be a decade his junior. Evan is also far more argumentative in this conversation than he is in the rest of the game. He stands up for himself through most of the accusations, when every other time he's faced adversity in the story, he's crumbled. Whether Tori actually left the company or not, I can't be sure. She probably doesn't hate or even dislike him, but he thinks she does. It seems more than possible that this is a situation that plays out in Evan's mind while lying awake at night. He sees this as something that is destined to one day happen. Tori will get sick of his awkward conversations and leave. Russell will be promoted and run the company into the ground. Troy's marriage falls apart and he ends up at the end of his tether. Some employees get fired. Some only wish that they had. Immediately after this scene, Evan imagines a conversation with a therapist and is shown lying in bed wearing his work clothes. Maybe he was getting ready for work when he became overwhelmed with an ocean of what-ifs and one-days and collapsed. Does the ending become less or more impactful if Evan never even went into his final day of work? The game maintains a mostly positive overall user score on Steam. Many of the reviews are from people who claim to be in similar life situations as Evan and find the game to be comforting and even inspiring for them to aim at a better quality of life. It's a unique title, not only for the sincerity of the subject matter, but the quality with which it was produced. There are wrinkles in the presentation, but the understanding and empathy actual Sunlight builds are well worth the experience.